Imagine shutting down New York City bridges, convoys of armored vehicles rolling through the streets, and a jury so secret that even their names were hidden from the world. All of this for one man, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the drug lord who escaped prisons, built tunnels under the border, and ran a billion-dollar empire. From the shadows, finally faced a courtroom he couldn't outsmart. His trial wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about whether the law could cage the most elusive criminal of our time. Joaquin Guzman wasn't born into power. He came from a tiny village in the mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico, where poverty wasn't a condition, it was a way of life. As a boy, he sold oranges and candy just to help his family eat. But by the 1980s, he had found a different trade: cocaine. From those beginnings, Guzman built the Sinaloa cartel into one of the most powerful drug organizations in history, moving tons of narcotics into the United States and raking in billions of dollars. They called him El Chapo, Spanish for shorty, because he barely cleared 5'6". But height didn't matter. What mattered was his ability to outthink, outbribe, and outgun anyone in his way. His cartel controlled territory with brutal violence, but also with a kind of Robin Hood mythology, handing out food, medicine, and money to the poor in Sinaloa. To some, he was a villain. To others, a folk hero. What truly made him infamous, though, were his escapes. In 2001, he slipped out of a Mexican prison in a laundry cart. In 2015, he vanished again, this time through a mile-long tunnel dug right under his cell, complete with lighting, ventilation, and even a motorcycle on rails. Each escape embarrassed the Mexican government and deepened the legend of a man untouchable by law. But in 2016, after a bloody manhunt, Guzman was captured for the last time. And 2 years later, he was extradited to the United States, where no tunnel, no bribe, and no myth could protect him. When El Chapo finally landed in New York, the city transformed into something that looked more like a military zone than a courtroom venue. Every time he was moved from his cell to the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, authorities shut down the Brooklyn Bridge. Armored convoys, flashing lights, and helicopters overhead. Thousands of commuters trapped in traffic, all for one man in shackles. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere wasn't any less extreme. The trial of Joaquin Guzman was nicknamed Fortress Brooklyn. U.S. Marshals armed to the teeth lined the halls. Metal detectors were everywhere. Even the judge, Brian Cogan, acknowledged the risk. Here was a defendant with a proven history of bribery, intimidation, and Houdini-level escapes. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who let El Chapo slip away a third time. Then there was the jury. Usually, jurors are known by name and sit in plain sight. Not this time. These 12 people were kept completely anonymous. They were escorted in and out of the courthouse by armed guards. They were told to avoid contact with the media, their own families, kept in the dark about details. Imagine being an ordinary citizen, asked to decide the fate of a man who had ordered assassinations, run a global cartel, and humiliated entire governments. This raised an unusual legal problem. How do you guarantee someone's right to a fair trial with the presumption of innocence when the very courtroom feels like a fortress preparing for war? The government came into court with more than just a story. They brought a mountain of evidence. Over 3 months, prosecutors presented jurors with an inside look at how the Sinaloa cartel moved drugs, laundered money, and silenced anyone who stood in the way. There were wiretaps, thousands of hours of Guzman's calls and encrypted messages. Some were intercepted by the FBI and DEA. Others came from cartel insiders who turned on him. Jurors listened as Guzman gave orders about cocaine shipments, security details, and even assassination plots. There were ledgers, carefully kept by cartel accountants, showing billions of dollars flowing in and out. There were photos of tunnels under the US-Mexico border, underground highways for smuggling tons of cocaine and heroin. There were videos of drug seizures, mountains of bricks stamped with cartel insignias, each worth millions. But the prosecution's most powerful evidence wasn't paper or recordings. It was people. More than 50 witnesses took the stand, many of them former cartel members who flipped to save themselves. Guzman's former right-hand man, Damaso Lopez, testified about bribes to politicians, generals, and police commanders. Mistresses described a life of luxury paid for with drug money. Even an IT worker from the cartel testified about installing spyware on Guzman's wives and girlfriends so he could read their messages in real time. The defense fought back hard. They attacked witnesses as liars, criminals who cut deals with prosecutors in exchange for lighter sentences. They objected to evidence gathered outside the U.S., raising questions about admissibility. Still, the sheer scale of what the government laid out was overwhelming. When it was their turn, El Chapo's lawyers had an impossible task: convince 12 ordinary citizens that the man sitting in front of them wasn't the kingpin everyone thought he was. Lead attorney Jeffrey Lichtman, known for defending mobsters, tried to turn the narrative upside down. Guzman, he argued, wasn't the boss at all. He was the fall guy. According to the defense, the true leader of the Sinaloa cartel was Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a man who had never been captured. El Mayo, they said, pulled the strings, paid the bribes, and ran the show, while Guzman took the blame. To support this theory, they pointed to witnesses who had every reason to lie. Many were convicted criminals, facing decades in prison. By cooperating, they could shave years off their sentences. Why wouldn't they invent stories about Guzman if it helped them? The defense hammered on credibility. They reminded the jury that cartel insiders were professional liars, people who had betrayed families, governments, and each other. Why should their testimony suddenly be believed when their freedom depended on pleasing prosecutors? But there was a larger problem no lawyer could overcome: Guzman's reputation. Every news outlet in the world had painted him as the most dangerous drug lord alive. Every escape, every assassination, every tunnel became part of the myth. And inside that Brooklyn courtroom, the myth itself felt like another witness testifying against him. The question was whether 12 anonymous jurors would see past the legend or let it decide his fate. In most criminal cases, jurors go home at night, talk to their families about mundane things, and try to forget the trial until the next day. El Chapo's jurors lived a very different reality. From day one, their identities were hidden. They were escorted to and from court by armed guards. Even their families had no idea exactly how the process worked. Judge Brian Cogan knew that if jurors were exposed, intimidation, or worse, could become a real danger. It was rare, almost unheard of in federal court, but for El Chapo, anonymity became standard procedure. The jurors sat just a few feet away from Guzman every day, watching as witness after witness accused him of murder, drug trafficking, and corruption. And while they were sworn to base their verdict only on the evidence, the outside world was impossible to ignore. The press covered the trial like it was the Super Bowl. Cameras captured every glimpse of Guzman's wife, Emma Coronel, as she walked into court in designer outfits. Reporters live-tweeted testimony about bribes to presidents and mistresses, smuggling drugs in shampoo bottles. Newspapers in Mexico and the U.S. ran front-page spreads with sensational headlines. After the verdict, a juror later admitted to Vice News that some members of the panel had broken the rules. They followed news coverage and even peeked at social media during the trial. That revelation raised an uncomfortable question. Did Guzman truly get the impartial jury guaranteed by the Constitution? On February 12, 2019, after more than 30 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its decision: guilty on all 10 counts. Guzman was convicted of leading a continuing criminal enterprise, trafficking massive amounts of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana into the United States, using firearms in furtherance of those crimes, and laundering billions of dollars in cartel profits. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. Guzman showed little reaction, but across Mexico, news outlets blasted the story. For years, he had been untouchable. Now, the world's most infamous drug trafficker had been brought down by a Brooklyn jury. In July 2019, Judge Brian Cogan handed down the sentence: life in prison, plus 30 years. Guzman was also ordered to forfeit $12.6 billion, a number representing the estimated profits from his drug empire. Everyone knew the money would never be collected. It was more symbolic than practical. Still, it was the law's way of saying that every penny made through blood and narcotics was illegitimate. After sentencing, Guzman was flown to Colorado, where he entered ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in America. Often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, it houses terrorists, spies, and cartel leaders in near-total isolation. For a man who once ruled over jungles, cities, and border crossings, his new reality was a 7 by 12-foot cell, 23 hours a day. The trial of Joaquin Guzman wasn't just about one man. It was a stress test for the American justice system, and it exposed both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. First, it showed how far U.S. prosecutors are willing to go in pursuing global criminals. Guzman was captured in Mexico, extradited to the U.S., and tried under American law for crimes committed across borders. Second, the case highlighted the heavy reliance on cooperators. Most of the testimony came from criminals who struck deals to reduce their sentences. Third, the jury's anonymity and post-trial revelations about breaking the rules reminded everyone how fragile the promise of a fair trial really is. Finally, the spectacle mattered. The trial became theater, covered nonstop by the press, dissected like a blockbuster movie. But beneath the headlines was the core principle of law. Even the most feared man in the drug trade was still entitled to a defense, still judged by 12 citizens, and still sentenced under rules that apply to everyone. For decades, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman seemed larger than life, a man who slipped through tunnels, bribed presidents, and mocked the very idea of justice. But in the end, it wasn't bullets or betrayals that brought him down. It was a courtroom. 12 jurors, shielded by anonymity, did what armies and manhunts could not. They caged the myth. Thanks for joining us today at Due Process Daily. Throw us a like and consider subscribing to the channel to help us grow.